When love defeats orders? Rewritten script? What would you do if your police dog suddenly refused to follow a direct command? It's not just any command, but an order to apprehend a suspect who might be dangerous. Well, that's exactly what happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in a local park. And what unfolded next will absolutely shatter your heart and restore your faith in the power of connection all at the same time. This story begins with what seemed like a routine call that would change everyone involved forever. It was one of those sleepy afternoon shifts where nothing much happens. Officers were finishing their lunch breaks. Kids were playing in the park. Parents were scrolling their phones on benches. Just another ordinary day. Then dispatch crackled to life. Suspicious individual near the children's playground. Possible vagrant. Officers requested for welfare check. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up to Riverside Park. The officers stepped out, scanning the area, and immediately spotted their person of interest. An elderly gentleman, probably in his 70s, sat alone on a weathered bench about 50 meters from the swings. He was clutching a battered military-style kit bag. His clothes clearly hadn't seen a washing machine in days. And he had that 1,000-yard stare that speaks of troubles too heavy for words. Now here's the thing about police works. Sometimes you've got to make judgment calls based on limited information. The man wasn't doing anything explicitly wrong, but his presence near the playground had made some parents nervous. Fair enough, really, today's world. You can't be too careful when children are involved. The first officer approached slowly. "Afternoon, sir. Mind if we have a quick chat?" The elderly man looked up, his eyes cloudy with confusion and exhaustion. And asked to stand and show what was in his bag, he struggled to his feet, wincing as though every movement caused pain. I'm just resting," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. But something about the situation didn't sit right with the officers. Maybe it was the way he clutched that bag. Maybe it was how he avoided eye contact. Or perhaps it was just that gut feeling every copper develops after years on the job. Either way, they called for backup. That's when things got interesting. The backup unit that arrived wasn't your typical patrol car. It was the K9 unit, complete with one of the most respected police dogs in the district. A magnificent German shepherd named Shadow, trained to perfection, obedient to a fault, and absolutely brilliant at his job. This dog had successfully apprehended dozens of suspects without incident. When Shadow was given a command, he followed it without question. The K9 officer stepped out, Shadow beside him, both scanning the scene with professional precision. By now, more parents had gathered their children and moved to safer distances. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone sensed this situation was about to escalate. "Last chance, sir," the K9 officer called out firmly. "Show us what's in that bag, and do it slowly." The elderly man tried to comply, but his hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the zipper. Whether it was fear, illness, or something else entirely, he simply couldn't move fast enough for the officer's liking. Now, if you've ever seen a police dog in action, you know it's both impressive and terrifying. These animals are pure muscle and instinct, trained to take down suspects with overwhelming force when necessary. Shadow launched forward exactly as he'd been trained to do, powerful legs propelling him across the grass with frightening speed. But then, something unprecedented happened. Just meters before impact, Shadow slammed on the brakes. His powerful frame skidded to a halt, sending up a small cloud of dust. Instead of the expected takedown, there was ... nothing. The dog just stood there, staring at the old man with what could only be described as confusion. Then Shadow did something that made everyone's blood run cold. He whimpered. Not a growl, not a bark of aggression, but a soft, heartbroken whine that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul. The elderly man, who should have been terrified, looked down at the massive German shepherd and whispered a single word: Shadow. At that name, the dog's entire demeanor changed. His ears pricked forward. His tail, which had been rigid with tension, began to wag tentatively. He took a careful step closer, then another, sniffing the air as though trying to solve a puzzle that had been troubling him for years. Shadow, the old man said again, this time with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. It's me, boy. It's Frank. And that's when the impossible happened. This highly trained police dog who'd been ordered to apprehend a suspect instead sat down gently and placed his massive head on the old man's lap. The officers stood frozen, trying to process what they were witnessing. The canine handler tugged on the leash, but Shadow wouldn't budge. Instead, He was making soft, almost human-like sounds of recognition and joy, nuzzling against Frank's trembling hands. "I thought they told me you were gone," Frank whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought I'd lost you forever. Now you're probably wondering what on earth was happening here. Well, it turns out this wasn't just any elderly vagrant and any police dog. This was a reunion 6 years in the making." A quick radio call to headquarters revealed the extraordinary truth. Franklin Ward, the man on the bench, was a former military canine handler who been reported missing and presumed dead after an overseas bombing 6 years earlier. His entire unit had been devastated in the attack. Somehow Frank had survived, but he'd sustained severe brain trauma that left him with memory issues and no identification. For 6 years, he'd been living rough, drifting from town to town, barely remembering who he was or where he belonged. Meanwhile, Shadow had been rescued from the same attack zone, retrained, and assigned to local police work.
Nice.
Neither knew the other had survived. But here's what absolutely destroyed everyone watching. Despite years of separation, despite new training and new commands, despite everything that should have overwritten his original programming, Shadow remembered. He remembered the man who'd raised him from a pup, who'd trained with him in the blazing desert heat, who'd shared his rations and whispered encouragement during the darkest nights overseas. The crowd that had gathered, expecting to see an arrest instead, witnessed something profound. Parents who'd been worried about their children's safety found themselves wiping away tears. Officers who approached with suspicion stood speechless as this powerful working dog transformed into something altogether different. Loyal companion finding his way home? Frank opened his kit bag with shaking hands, not because he was hiding anything dangerous, but because it contained the only possessions he had left from his previous life. Old photos, a tattered service medal, and a worn leather collar with Shadow etched into the brass nameplate. When Shadow saw that collar, he pressed closer to Frank, his tail wagging with increasing enthusiasm. 6 years of separation melted away in an instant. The dog began licking Frank's face with the desperate affection of someone who'd been searching without even knowing what they were looking for. The canine officer, still holding the leash, found himself crying. "He's never disobeyed a command," he said quietly. "Never. But he knew, didn't he? Somehow he just knew." Now this is where the story gets even more beautiful. Within hours, the situation had been sorted. Frank was taken to hospital for a proper evaluation, while Shadow remained by his side, refusing to leave even when officers tried to lead him away. Social services got involved, Veterans Affairs was contacted, and slowly, all the pieces of Frank's lost life began falling back into place. It turned out he had family who'd been searching for him for years. A daughter who'd never given up hope, nephews who'd grown up hearing stories about their Uncle Frank and his amazing dog. They'd held memorial services, but something inside them had always wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was still out there somewhere. The reunion was everything you'd imagine, and more. Frank's daughter collapsed into his arms, sobbing about how she'd driven through countless towns, posted thousands of flyers, and never stopped believing he was alive. Shadow sat beside them, tail wagging, as though he understood he'd played a part in bringing this family back together. But what about Shadow's career as a police dog? Okay, well, that's where this story takes another beautiful turn. The department made an unprecedented decision. After 6 years of exemplary service, Shadow was granted early retirement. It's not as punishment for disobeying orders, but as recognition that some bonds transcend professional duty. The canine officer who worked with him put it perfectly. He's earned the right to go home. Frank and Shadow moved into a veterans housing complex where they could be together properly for the first time in 6 years. Frank's memory began improving with familiar company and proper care. Shadow, meanwhile, seemed to shed years of stress and uncertainty, becoming playful again in ways his police colleagues had never seen. The staff at the housing complex said it was remarkable to watch. Frank would wake up each morning and the first thing he'd do was call Shadow's name. Shadow would bound over, tail wagging, ready for whatever the day might bring. Simple morning walks became adventures. Quiet evenings became contentment neither had experienced in years. But here's what makes this story truly special. This wasn't just about one man and one dog finding each other again. It was about a system that chose compassion over protocol when it mattered most. Those officers could have insisted on pressing charges for the original disturbance. The department could have kept Shadow in service regardless of the circumstances. Social services could have processed Frank through the usual channels without considering his unique situation. Instead, everyone involved recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary and chose to protect it rather than destroy it. The local community rallied around them too. Donations poured in for Frank's medical care. Children from the neighborhood started visiting, bringing treats for Shadow and asking Frank to tell stories about his military service. What had begun as a suspicious situation became a celebration of second chances and unbreakable bonds. Shadow still carries himself with the dignity of a working dog, but now his job is simply being Frank's companion. And Frank, whose memory may never fully return, has something more valuable than perfect recall. He has his best friend back. Think about that for a moment. In a world where we're constantly told that moving on means letting go, these two proved that some connections are simply too strong to break. Shadow could have followed his training, done his job, and continued his police career without ever knowing who that old man really was. Whoa. But something deeper than conditioning recognized love, even after years of separation and confusion. This story reminds us that loyalty isn't just a word we throw around lightly. Real loyalty survives trauma, transcends circumstances, and recognizes truth even when everything else has changed. Shadow didn't just disobey an order that day. He chose love over duty, recognition over routine, and connection over compliance. And perhaps most importantly, he reminded every person watching that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is unauthority or training or even survival instinct. Sometimes it's simply the unshakable bond between two souls who refuse to forget each other, no matter how long the separation or how impossible the odds. So next time you're tempted to give up on someone or something that matters to you, remember Frank and Shadow. Remember that love has a memory all its own, and that sometimes the most beautiful reunions happen when we least expect them. What's your most powerful story of loyalty or unexpected connection? Share it in the comment side. Love to hear from you. And if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible true stories that LL remind you why. Human and animal connections are absolutely magical. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love that never forgets.